In 1975, three friends living in London decided to form a company around the mutual hobby that brought them all together: tabletop gaming. They decided to call this company Games Workshop, and unbeknownst to them, 47 years later, a scaly with too much time on their hands would spend months researching their entire history in order to compile it into a series of video essays documenting their history in a more easily accessible manner than months of trudging through wiki articles and obscure WordPress blogs. Hello, all you space marines and neophyte hybrids. My name is Salamander, and welcome to the first episode of Historyhammer. Games Workshop, after its founding in 1975, would go on to become one of the single most influential companies in the medium of tabletop gaming. Obviously, if you're on this channel, you know about Warhammer 40,000, the most financially successful tabletop wargame in all of human history, titan of nerd culture, as well as the central focus of both my D-tier channel and dozens of other channels in an increasingly diverse community. But very little is known about its humble beginnings, and this will be the focus of our first episode. The years 1975 through 1983, the year GW was founded, and the year the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles was released. Think of this kind of as the prologue to the rest of the series. So, Games Workshop started by producing wooden boards for traditional tabletop games, like chess or backgammon, but even in these simple beginnings, there was already conflict. Between the three founders, John Peake was a very traditional tabletop gamer, preferring games like Go and Nine Men's Morris over the continually growing market of tabletop role-playing games and video games. These were both things that the other two founders, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, were passionate about pursuing, and this would result in John Peake's departure from the company less than a year after its founding. And with him, Games Workshop was now able to freely pursue their vision of adapting to the ever-evolving tabletop games industry. However, at this time, the company was kind of broke, since John Peake was also the guy who was largely responsible for the manufacturing of their old line of wooden board products. So GW needed a new source of revenue, and fast. And they would get that through a 3-year licensing deal with TSR to distribute Dungeons & Dragons to Europe. Their magazine, initially known as Owl and Weasel, but would later be known as White Dwarf, started publishing supplemental rules for Dungeons & Dragons, including the Fiend Factory column, which would then go on to have a line of models produced by the newly formed GW daughter company of Citadel, which became the company's primary model manufacturing branch. This was a status quo for the company that would persist for the next 3 years, until 1978, where they were finally able to open their first retail store, right as their licensing deal with TSR ran out. Yeah, GW would try to extend this licensing deal, but TSR wanted to merge with the fledgling tabletop games company and keep them as a permanent D&D distributor. Considering TSR would later go on to get bought out by Wizards of the Coast, imagine if Games Workshop was a subsidiary of TSR by then. Warhammer, Magic the Gathering, and Dungeons & Dragons would all be owned by a single company. That's scary. Really dodged a bullet there. Glad to know this isn't the worst timeline in some respects, just most of them. But with GW no longer having the licensing rights to D&D, a new product had to be created by the company, one that was owned exclusively by them. And at around the same time, in 1982, two of GW's founders, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, were inexplicably working on a project together that had no relation at all to Games Workshop, called Fighting Fantasy. Games Workshop would later go on to publish a tie-in magazine that contained new rules for Fighting Fantasy, which would also come with a model line created by GW's miniatures manufacturing brand Citadel, but still was not an official GW product. I have no idea. Fighting Fantasy found great success, and remains a staple of British fantasy media to this day. However, through the combined efforts of Rick Priestley and Brian Ansell, the latter of which was the managing director for Citadel at the time, a new game would be made which would repurpose a lot of models they had been making for D&D and Fighting Fantasy, including the old Fiend Factory column. That game would come to be known as Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and would innovate on the wargaming genre by introducing elements from tabletop RPGs. Instead of piloting massed armies of hundreds or even thousands of models set in a historical setting, you were playing as a group of a few dozen models set in a Tolkien-esque fantasy setting, or more specifically, a fantasy setting very strangely reminiscent of D&D. Very notoriously, the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles used a lot of the models they made from their days as a D&D manufacturer, with the Slaawn in particular being a riff on the Slod, which were introduced in the Fiend Factory column, which still exist in both game worlds today. This charming and strange little rulebook would provide the basis for what is, at this point in our story, a fledgling little fantasy wargame. But unbeknownst to everyone, this fledgling little fantasy wargame is poised to change the landscape of not only wargaming, but fantasy and later sci-fi as a genre. But that is a story for another day. Yeah, sorry this episode was so short. I wanted to make this video in order to test the waters and see how this style of video would be received. There's lots of opportunity for this to become a long-running series, as there is a whole 39 years of history I didn't cover in this one video. If you want me to keep making episodes in this series, say so in a comment or drop a like. And you should subscribe if you want to see when the next episodes in the series come out. A big thanks to Wib for helping me write this script. He was invaluable, both as a fact checker and just someone to bounce ideas off of. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons, such as Henry Michelle, Jamie Harris, Cassie Fox, Paul Camagliano, Serena J. Fleming, Randon Pearson, and my $15 patron, Lucifer King. If you want to join them, you can down in the description. You get access to a private Discord, and patrons see these videos a little early. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.